Welcome back, everybody, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, the place to come for attempted Olympian judgments about history, religion, and culture and why they matter. And today we have a brand new co-host, the wonderful Rosalind Collada-Cedra.
Thank you. And today we're starting a brand new series on 20th century Hungary. I know for a fact this was a last-minute change of plans because of last week's astounding election result.
Yes, I think lots of people all around the world were paying attention to that. There was a general feeling that Orbán was going to fall from power, but uncertainty. Would he create a crisis, gerrymander things at the last moment, massage the results, and so on? But in the end, it was so overwhelming that he's gone.
Now, a majority inside Hungary and a majority outside are glad to see the back of him. But can we remind viewers or tell people who maybe don't know who that is and what his political program was?
Well, he was one of the new wave of far-right authoritarians whose program was essentially the destruction of democracy. He said he was standing for what he called illiberal democracy, which for people who are opposed to certain definitions of liberalism might sound okay, but actually he meant that in the most negative possible sense, that he was undermining democracy as a whole, gerrymandering the electoral system, cutting back on the rule of law, extremely corrupt, funneling funds to his family and close associates, and so on, holding back, choking back the judiciary and the media, turning the media into simply spokes things for his government, and on and on. So, yes, I think most people of all shades of opinion, or nearly all shades of opinion, are glad to see him gone.
So, looking at the long view, how we got into this situation and what we can learn from that is what the series is all about.
Yes, it is. We're going to be shooting through many centuries of Hungarian history today to show why this country is so distinctive and why its relations with its neighbours are not always terrible, but they're different. And that gives it a different pattern internally as well.
Hungary is not exactly a favorite among its 7 neighbors.
No, it's not. So if we look at the neighbours here, we can see them clockwise from the left. So we got Austria, with whom Hungary was very closely associated since, let's say, the late 17th century, period of time leading up to World War I. It was the key half, as it were, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which then existed until the end of that war. Slovakia was generally part of Hungary for hundreds and hundreds of years until the end of World War I. There is still a small Hungarian minority in Ukraine, which is sometimes the locus of friction between those two countries, although we'd say that's the least of the issues between them under Orbán, who has been trying to prevent the European Union from helping Ukraine in its war to hold off Russia. Concerning Romania, there are large territories in what's now Romania, particularly Transylvania and part of the Banat, which have still today large ethnic Hungarian minorities, and which probably a majority of people inside Hungary today think should belong to Hungary. So relations there have been difficult, particularly in the 20th century. A milder version of the same thing in respect of Serbia. The northern part of Serbia, north of the Danube, had a very large number of Hungarians. That's been reduced over the last 100 years or so, but that's still there. Relations with Croatia are, well, not great because of Orbán, but in the longer run, in more recent times, okay. But loads of Croatia was part of Hungary for several hundred years, and there were frictions around that. Slovenia, I don't really know. I think it's okay. But you can see that it's a slightly tetchy relationship or set of relationships all round.
It's the regional oddball.
Yeah.
Is that anything to do with its unusual language? Like, is that part of why it, shall we say, doesn't have the most natural friends around?
that's no small part of it. It's not generally the upfront reason, but one suspects it's a kind of underlying reason in the sense of mental distancing. The surrounding countries are either German speaking or Slavic speaking or Romanian, which is Romance language. Whereas Hungarian is in a category not quite all by itself, but certainly all by itself given where it's located. And we can see that from this map here showing the migration of the Hungarian tribes. So the Hungarians arrived in the Carpathian Basin, roughly where they are now then, in the 9th century.
So they showed up 400 years late for the barbarian invasions?
Yeah, that's one way of putting it. Most of the barbarian invasions of the Western Roman Empire occurred during the course of the 5th, in some cases early 6th century. There were several such centuries of complete turmoil in those regions, with wave after wave of barbarians, newly arrived tribes fighting one another to establish principalities and kingdoms and so on. Finally, all of them adopting Christianity as a compulsory governmental religion, as a civilizing factor. And then just as the dust is starting to settle down a bit, 400 years in, bam, here come the Hungarian tribes right out of Central Asia. Well, Central Asia, right out of the Urals area. So yes, that was disturbing. And like I say, they have this very, very different language to everybody else as well, which they have brought with them from the Ural regions, the mountains several hundred miles east of Moscow. Yeah.
It's a nice painting.
Yes, it's a very nice painting depicting the arrival of the Hungarians in the Danube
With a
Valley.
with a piece of romantic nationalism.
Yes, it is romantic nationalism. It's 19th century stuff, so that's the high tide of romantic nationalism. The painter Mihaly Munkacs is being a little romantic about himself. His real surname was Lieb, Lieb, which is as German as that looks and sounds, but he adopted the name of his native village, Munkacs, to Hungarianize himself, and then stuck a Y on the end, which in Hungarian signifies some kind of noble origins. So that's a pure affectation.
He does this, why? To make
Well,
himself a noble, make himself belong?
yes, it's social affectation in two directions at once, one ethnic and one kind of social stratum. Well, one other thing we should say at the outset here, and this will apply to all our references to names in this episode and the next 3 episodes. In Hungarian, you're supposed to give the family or surname first and then the personal name after. So in Hungary, he would be known as Munkacs Michael, right? But for the sake of clarity for everybody except Hungarians, we're putting it in the way, putting the names in the way round that we're more used to. But just so that people are aware of this. Yeah. Here we've got King Stephen, Saint Stephen, and you've got his dates there from around 975 to 1038. Became the Grand Prince of the Hungarians in 997, and then King in 1000, which is when he forcibly Christianized his country.
Why? Is this about cultural assimilation or reducing tension?
Yes, it is. That's a lot of it. If we want to think of a contemporary simile, we might think of the way in which people in leaders in very poor countries in the world, some say in sub-Saharan Africa and maybe a few other places, will adopt Western argot and ways of talking, say human rights, which would be an alien concept to them, talk in international bodies and international leaders simply as a way of engaging with other more powerful countries with which they have to interact. And in a sense, that's what Stephen's doing, and he's far from the first to do that. So let's adopt this kind of civilization. It'll reduce tensions, it'll help us to fit into the region. And of course, I hope it goes without saying that introducing Christianity this way is not anything that we would recognize now. This is nothing to do with personal conversions. So here we've got a statue of his wife, Gisela of Bavaria, and she's a sister of the Holy Roman Emperor.
Can we remind folks, what is the Holy Roman Empire?
Yes, we should do. We've said this in a number of episodes, but of course, some
But for
people.
anyone who's not hanging on your every word.
Yes, yes. Or for people for whom this is their first episode, the Holy Roman Empire is nothing to do with the Roman Empire, except trying to introduce a kind of connotation language there. It is a sort of Greater Germany, embracing a whole load of territories surrounding Germany, and is the biggest single entity in the medieval West from the time of Charlemagne in 800 through to, let's say, the 17th century, something like that. So she is the sister of that German emperor. So she's a pretty good person to marry, really, if you want to have high connections. She's also canonized as a saint because she's his partner in Christianizing the Hungarians, a process that she helped further by importing Catholic missionary priests, so they will have been overwhelmingly German missionary priests from her homeland.
So marriage, canonization, and importing priests? Is this all about politics and pragmatics?
Yes, it is. Yes, we tend to think of religious faith and religious belief, whether we're looking at the early church or whether we're looking at nowadays, we tend to think of it in terms of personal conviction and conversion and this kind of stuff.
But that has nothing to do with any of this. It's
No, it has
about
nothing to do with
social
any of this.
order.
Christianity had been stood on its head from the late 4th, early 5th centuries onwards and simply become an official religion that is then imposed upon people in a whole number of states. And that, sadly, is how it remained for many centuries. Yes, and that's what's going on here. Well, we can see this quite clearly in this account. Now, you can see it's written in the late 11th century, so maybe, who knows, 80 years after the events it describes, the so-called Chronicon Pozoniensi, about his forcible Christianization of Hungary. And when he, Stephen, could not convert them, his subjects, by exhortation, he had to suppress them by force of arms.
So this has nothing whatsoever to do with personal conviction. Again, it's purely about social order.
Yes, it is. Christianity had become, since the late Roman Empire, an official religion and the rationale for justifying the status quo. This is why you should obey the authorities. This is the will of God. You should be part of the required religion because that's the will of God, and all of this. And that goes, I'm afraid, cascading on down the generations for many hundreds of years. So Stephen is buying into all that because it's the only thing really you can do. Pretty much all of his neighbors are run along these lines. You've got to get along with them. So, yes. So as to be able to do so, and since there were more of his subjects who rejected the faith than those who adhered to it, he thought it necessary to inform Christian kings and sovereigns, the kings of the neighbouring states, of his wish. And as soon as these had learnt his wish, they not only sent help, but also came themselves, for they'd suffered much harm from the cruelty of the Hungarians.
The cruelty of the Hungarians, what? What is that?
Well, what had happened over the previous few generations was that right after the Hungarians arrived in the Carpathian Basin, they made raids, seizing booty and slaves and so on, deep into the surrounding kingdoms. And this is happening at a time when, as we've said, those other kingdoms had kind of settled down after a period of all that stuff, and they're now on a smoother plane. And now this is all starting up again due to these Hungarians. So surrounding kings would have been very anxious to send him even military help and certainly missionary priests and so on to further this process along so that Hungary kind of fits into the pattern of the neighbors. Yeah. Okay, so leaping forward just for a moment from the year around 1000 AD to now, here we've got a photograph of St. Stephen's Basilica, so named after him, built from 1851 onwards for reasons we'll discuss in a few minutes. And it's a focal point in Budapest.
We went there 4 years ago, right?
Yeah, we did. Yes. It's built for modern nationalism. It's a kind of national totem. So it's a focus of national cohesion, if you like. He is the definitive Hungarian king that made Hungary what it would become in the long run, culturally, and part of the Catholic, later Catholic and Protestant West, and so on, that kind of thing. Well, there are a number of really illustrious kings that are worthy of mention, and we're not going to mention most of them, but we'll touch base with this one, Koloman, or in Hungarian, Kalman the Learned. You can see there he's king at the turn of the 12th century, so from 1095. From 1097, he becomes king of Croatia as well, more firmly actually from 1102 onwards. So because of dynastic marriages, Croatia, which had only been a kingdom for a relatively short time, then gets incorporated into the Hungarian realm. So hereabouts, I'm living in Croatia, as I think you all know. It gets referred to in schools as Croatia-Hungary, but everybody else calls it Hungary-Croatia. And here we've got a map showing Hungary just before that acquisition. And even there, it looks rather different to what it does today, the big green area in the middle. And after those acquisitions, you can see Transylvania and Slavonia, so what we now call Eastern Croatia, actually where I am. The northern strip of Bosnia there, the Bosnian March, and so on.
So Hungary then was way bigger than it is now.
Yes.
Is that where some of its grievances come from?
Yes, because although there have been a number of serious turns in the road, which we're going to deal with now, in the long term, it's that kind of size until the end of World War One, and being reduced to the small country in Central Europe that it is now, that was a really, really big blow. And some people still haven't got over it, but we'll come on to that in more detail in a few minutes. So yes, that's exactly right. Well, leaping ahead here, we've got Hungary pretty much the same sort of size just before 1241.
The moment before the disaster.
Yes. Well, this is when the Mongols invaded, coming right across the steppe out of Central Asia, and they hit Eastern and Central Europe like a rocket. Nobody could stand in their way. Their weapons were better, their tactics were better. And the Hungarian king at the time, Bela IV, went right down to the Adriatic coast to the town of Trogir, and he really thought he was a goner, that he had nowhere else to flee to. And miraculously for him, the Mongols had news that their leader back in Central Asia had died and simply abandoned the siege and went home again. And so he could go back to his capital, but of course his kingdom was absolutely devastated by this storm that came out of the east. Now we're going to scroll forward here to another disaster that occurred 300 years later. And this shows the Kingdom of Hungary, or Hungary-Croatia, before 1526. And this is, as it were, we're this year in the 500th anniversary of this fresh disaster. The area you can see in red there is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Turks had invaded pretty much all of the Balkans, except for a strip you can see there in white along the coast, which was governed by Venice. And their next step was to attack the Kingdom of Hungary, which in 1526 they did. The disaster at the Battle of Mohacs that year was complete. Here we've got a Turkish miniature of that battle. Here is the results on the map again. We're going to stop throwing quite so many maps at you in a moment. Apologies for this. As a result of which, the Kingdom of Hungary was completely destroyed. So the area in yellow is simply absorbed by the Ottomans and added to their empire. It includes where I'm sitting now, right now, by the way, in Osijek in eastern Croatia, and right up into central Hungary there. The area in blue is broadly Transylvania, and that became a vassal state of the Ottomans, not directly occupied, but had to pay them taxes and this kind of thing. And the area in green, after about 4 or 5 years of generally messing around and fighting between local nobles to see who was going to be in charge and all that kind of thing, was mopped up by the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperor, based in Vienna by this stage, and simply absorbed into his realms. Now, that is the distant beginnings of what would become, in the run-up to World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that bright green coloured area is the one to watch. All right, and here we have a 17th century sketch of Buda in the distance on the hill there, and Pest in the foreground under the Ottomans.
And Buda and Pest were two separate places.
Yes, they were, and remain so at least formally down to 1873, actually. So on either bank of the River Danube.
Before we move on here, viewers, hello. I'm very happy to be joining you, and I just want to take a moment to invite you, if you're enjoying this kind of discussion, to share it on your socials, tell your friends, and repost so that we can share the discussion with your friends too.
Yes, please.
Okay, on we go.
Okay, well, we're going to jump forward now to the 19th century. But before we really get into that, I just need to explain how the Habsburgs had conquered the rest of Hungary from the Ottomans. The Ottomans had made an attempt in 1683 to besiege Vienna. They nearly succeeded in capturing it, but finally were defeated. And following that, the Habsburgs rolled the Ottomans all the way back. And this is the beginnings of the long, slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, losing more and more of their territory in Europe and indeed elsewhere later on. So what happened is, in the aftermath of that, the next few years, the Habsburgs captured the rest of Hungary from the Ottomans, and that's now incorporated into their realms. So just to stay again with the city where I happen to live, medieval Osijek had been destroyed completely by the Ottomans when they came here in 1526 around the Battle of Mohacs, and it had been rebuilt as a Turkish city with mosques and everything. And then in the 1690s, when the Habsburgs came, it had been redestroyed. So the oldest buildings that we have in this city now are those built by the Habsburgs around 1700. Okay, so from then on, the whole of Hungary comes under Habsburg rule. And in modern times, which is to say in the 19th century, there's significant discontent with that, with the rising tide of modern nationalism. So that leads in 1848 to 9 to an attempted Hungarian revolution. Now, many people will know that in those years there were nationalist-inspired revolts in many, many parts of Europe, certainly in many parts of the Habsburg Empire, and the Hungarian Revolution was one of the more important. And this guy here, Lajos Kossuth, is the most important of its leaders. He was a lawyer, a journalist, a politician. He came from Protestant minor nobility. We should just mention in passing that amongst Hungarians, they break about 2-1 Catholic versus Protestant. His mother was an ethnic German, and because the revolution was briefly successful, he becomes governor-president of Hungary for a few months in 1849. The rising was eventually crushed, and he spent the rest of his life in England, then in the US, and finally, for most of the rest of his life, in Italy. And we've got a picture here of Kossuth recruiting volunteers in Cegléd for the independent Hungarian army in September 1848. And a painting here showing the surrender of that army to the Russians at Vilagos near Arad, which is now in Romania, in August 1849.
Wait. Why are the Russians involved in a fight in the Habsburg Empire?
Well, the Tsar took the view that he didn't want people bringing down the power of his brother emperors. He might be their rival, in some cases their enemy, in certain geopolitical contexts, but that didn't mean that he wanted nasty modernist political forces, in this case nationalism, bringing them down or creating new nation states, because the habit might be catching. The Russian Empire included a whole load of nationalities, some of which were potentially, and later on actually, dominated by nationalist discourses. So it would lead to his own ungluing. So it was, what's the word we want? Enlightened self-interest. Maybe not enlightened, but at any rate, self-interest.
Altruistic self-interest?
Yes, something like that. Yes. Here we have a statue to Kossuth outside the Hungarian parliament today. So he counts as a Hungarian national hero. Well, perhaps we should say a little bit about what's going on the Habsburg side of the equation. So here we have a portrait of Franz Josef, born in 1830, became emperor in 1848 as a young man, although in this painting I think he looks significantly older than just 18. So his uncle, Ferdinand I, the emperor, wasn't really up to being emperor because of his mental and health conditions. And he'd been persuaded, correctly really, by his family and others to retire in favor of young Franz Josef.
Now, most of us think of this guy as a doddering old man in the run-up to World War I.
Which, of course, he was. I mean, he lives to be, well, let's do the math here, 86. And yes, he certainly looked the part of a doddery old man during those years, but even doddery old men, so it is rumoured, were once young, fit, and virile. And
I mean, not all, clearly.
Clearly not all, no. But in his case, I think we can give him the benefit of the doubt. And we have here a portrait of his lovely wife, Elizabeth, known universally as Sisi. And she really disliked the stifling rituals of court life in Vienna. Her mother-in-law, this was a classic case of sort of rather harsh mother-in-law syndrome. She did everything to make her uncomfortable and ill at ease. And so Sisi much preferred the plain-speaking Hungarians and began to learn their language, which is no small feat because it's not simply an unusual language, it's an extremely difficult one. And she was absolutely adored for this in Hungary.
She was way more popular than her husband, right?
Yeah, not just in Hungary, just generally. She was a glamorous figure with rather more of the common touch. Although, having said that, not to detract from her or her personality, the bar was rather low. The Viennese court was notoriously stuffy and protocol bound, more so, I think, than any other court in Europe, even more than Russia.
Would she have been like the 150 years back version of Princess Di?
Yes, I think perhaps she would. Yes, yes, something like that. Of course, the British royal house by the late 20th century and all royal houses were an awful lot more relaxed than anything in the 19th century. But the parallel, yeah, probably holds good, I think. Yes, yes. Well, they had 4 children, the first of whom sadly died just at the age of 2, Sophie. And that death left Cece with prolonged bouts of depression for the rest of her life. The 3 after that were Gisela, and she married a Bavarian prince and had 4 children of her own. Rudolf, who was the heir apparent, but he was a problem child. He was close to his sisters. He was a liberal in politics, like his mother, really. And although he got married in 1881, he had multiple affairs and died in a suicide pact with a 17-year-old mistress. It's very, very discreditable in many respects, but particularly because almost certainly the young mistress wasn't all that willing. I think she was badgered into it. This was about him and the need to feel accompanied when he killed himself. So pretty terrible, really. And then there's another sister, Marie Valerie, who married an archduke and went on to have 10 children.
But neither of those sisters inherited. So is that because only the son could inherit the throne?
Yes. I mean, it was fairly standard practice that sons took priority, but I think it's unique, maybe almost unique, let's say unique to the Habsburg throne, that only sons could inherit at all. And that is just typical of their protocol-bound existence. You know, all of this stuff. I mean, I think it's fairly well known and notorious that when Franz Ferdinand, who then becomes the heir to the throne, he's a nephew or great nephew, I think, of Franz Josef after Rudolf kills himself. His marriage, which was extremely happy and devoted to Sophie, this is the couple who were assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. It was a morganatic marriage which means that their children could not inherit, because although Sophie was herself noble, she wasn't noble enough. She was several degrees below what would have been required. I mean, this, and she was shunned and snubbed at all kinds of opportunities during their marriage. So this is absolutely typical for the Habsburg court. And even by the standards of the 19th century, that was considered ridiculous and reprehensible. This is what they're like. Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's absurd. Not noble enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Okay, well, shifting gear a little. Here we have a sketch of Buda on the right and especially Pest on the left, which grew massively, especially Pest, during the 19th century. And this is from 1850.
Buda is the place on the hill on the right with the fancy old town buildings and the palaces, and then Pest is the sprawling growth on the other side of the Danube.
Yes, but it's been going on for long enough that Pest has plenty of fancy stuff too, particularly by the later 19th century. So including the Parliament building that everybody today admires so much, all the tourists love it, and St. Stephen's Basilica, as we saw earlier on, that is actually in Pest, and much more besides. But certainly before the 19th century, Buda was the fancy place and Pest was where the hoi polloi lived. And that's the one that grew really, really fast. Yes. Okay, well, moving very swiftly through some photographs from the period here. We've got a Hungarian noble lady around 1850. And another one, Countess Johanna Erdődy. Here we've got some Austrian soldiers, or at least soldiers from the empire as a whole, I'm not quite sure from which part, in the 1860s.
And now we're going to look at the imperial authorities' delayed response to the 1848-1849 revolution to placate the rising tide of Hungarian nationalism.
Right. So the basilica is in fact part of that, a sop to the fact that the Hungarian nationalist revolution had been crushed. Well, okay, let's build a basilica to Hungary's patron saint. But then there's something way, way bigger than that. And that's what we call the Ausgleich, so a compromise that the empire makes with its biggest and in some ways most troublesome non-German ethnicity, the Hungarians. And here are the details of that Ausgleich made in 1867, which turns the Austrian Empire into what we then call Austria-Hungary. So it will be administered in two halves, one from Vienna and another from Buda. Franz Josef would be emperor, Kaiser, in Austria, as he had been, and king, König, of Hungary. So we are now re-establishing Hungary as the old Kingdom of Hungary in something like its pre-Ottoman shape and size. It would have its own parliament, its own legal system and constitution. All ministries would be separate except for the foreign ministry, defense, diplomacy, and also finance as far as touching the previous three. There was surprisingly no common citizenship or passport. These were either Austrian or Hungarian. But Franz Josef retained the right to call and dismiss Parliament and to veto bills, to appoint and dismiss members of the cabinet, and complete control of the military.
So almost a constitutional monarchy, but it looks like the monarch still has far more control than, say, Britain at this time.
Yes, far more control. Monarchs hadn't had the real right to call and dismiss parliaments in Britain for a long time, right? The monarch had become essentially the servant of a whole system, a parliamentary system. And talking of parliaments, in Hungary, only 7% of adult males had the right to vote, which is an even smaller percentage than in Britain before the Great Reform Bill of 1832, when it was about 10% and then started to rise and kept rising during the century to embrace more and more people.
7% based on what? Property?
Yes, I'm not actually quite clear on that. It's going to be partly property and partly social rank, I think, where those don't coincide. By the way, this might be the point to mention that Hungary has this in common with Poland and Sicily, that you could be technically noble, but still pretty poor. Being a noble in most places meant you were almost certainly fairly wealthy, but the nobility class in Hungary and in Poland and in Sicily, while we're about it, was fairly large. So, yeah. Now, the irony here is that although Hungarians, particularly nationalist-minded Hungarians, which with the passing of time was more and more of them, often talked as though they were an oppressed people under the Austrian Empire, when they're given their head here, and you've got the Ausgleich, they rigorously Magyarized all administration, public institutions, railways, schools, the lot, inside their own half of the empire. So it's pretty hypocritical, really. Okay, well, map time again. This shows how this worked out. So the red shaded areas are those that are part of Austria governed from Vienna. Yellow is Hungary or Hungary and Croatia, governed from Buda. And then a decade and a bit after the Ausgleich was made, the empire came to govern Bosnia, taking it over from the Ottomans. but it wasn't added to either half because that would then have created an imbalance either in territory or population or something like that. So it was treated as a kind of anomaly, but within the empire.
So one can see how decision-making over time could become sclerotic, shall we say?
Yes, yes. No very obvious decisive control. And this would become crucial in the run-up to and during World War One. Right? The military at that point tried very hard to take back central control and to some extent succeeded. But historians have pored over all the maneuverings before the outbreak of the fighting. And yeah, there was quite a bit of dithering because, the Austrians thought this and the Hungarians thought that, and
And
etc.
it was just rigid. The decision-making process didn't have room for movement as
Yes.
swiftly as needed.
Well, just a couple of pictures here showing the immediate aftermath of the Ausgleich. So here we've got Franz Josef. Remember, he's already been emperor since 1848. His name in Hungarian is Ferenc József, and his wife Elizabeth, in Hungarian Erzsébet, are being crowned as king and queen of Hungary in St. Matthias Church up on Buda. And you and I have been up outside that some years ago as well, I think. There we are. And then later in the day, taking the coronation oath outside the basilica down in Pest. Okay, well, just a couple more maps here, and I feel we've seen so many maps today, I feel I need to apologize for it. So here we've got an ethnic map of Austria-Hungary in 1910. So the German speakers in the red areas and the Czech speakers in light blue, Slovak speakers, very similar language, in brown, Hungarian in green, Romanian in orange, Polish in purple, Ukrainian in sludgy yellow there, Italian in shocking green in those little areas, South Tyrol and one or two other places, Slovene in the area labeled Carniola there, and then, well, the language that was until about 30 years ago called Serbo-Croat, so Croatian and Serbian in the kind of sandy, shaded areas there. Now, all of this in the pre-modern world had been absolutely unremarkable. Indeed, national or language differences would have been noticed by scarcely anybody and hardly recorded on a map. But by the mid-19th century, with fast-rising national consciousness and predicated on that nationalism as a political force, right? You can't become a nationalist unless you're thinking in national terms and have national consciousness. This kind of situation was starting to be looked upon as chaotic or ridiculous.
Or even as the prison house of nations. Oppressive.
Yes, the prison house of nations was a phrase used many, many times by nationalists of all stripes to describe and to denounce the Habsburg Empire.
So by the time we get into the early 20th century, then Hungary has a pretty fancy capital, but still a very traditional countryside.
Yes, it does. Well, let's just take a look at a few pictures of that increasingly fancy capital as we come to a close here. So here is Andrássy út in Budapest in 1896. And in the same street, a cross-section of the first metro line under it in the 1890s. The Budapest system is the third oldest underground service in the world after London and Liverpool. So, this is no backwater. It is not to be sneered at all. It's becoming very sophisticated indeed. Here's work going on building the underground in the 1890s. And here is construction of the Hungarian Parliament building in the late 19th century, which looks so magnificent today. Of course, it's unfinished there. And yeah, by 1900, Budapest is a bustling, modern metropolis.
So just for context, when did the London Underground start getting built? Or the Paris Metro? Or
1870s, I think. Maybe even 1860s, 1870s, yeah. And please don't press me on the Liverpool one because I don't know. So between then and the 1890s, I should think. Okay, so here we've got a Slovak family in 1907. And just to underscore something, for centuries, what's now Slovakia was Upper Hungary. And moving a lot further south, this is the city of Pécs in what's now southern Hungary. It's about 30 miles north of where I am in 1909. And just to look at some of the ethnic balances again, so here we've got a map showing the proportion of Hungarians in Hungary in 1890. So they're only a really overwhelming majority in the areas in some shade of very dark red there. And then fewer and fewer in the areas around them where you've got Slovaks, Ruthenians, people we'd call Ukrainians, Romanians, of course, Serbs, Germans, Croats. And finally, this shows the linguistic breakdown of the Hungarian kingdom. So Hungarian speakers are less than 50% of that kingdom. And speakers of Croatian and Serbian are just over 14%. Romanian, 14%. German speakers, nearly 10%. Slovaks, over 9%. And Rusin or Ukrainian, 2.3%. But there are other languages as well.
very disparate.
Yeah, very, very disparate indeed. Nationalistic-minded Hungarians were very concerned about this because on the one hand, they were strong supporters of the Ausgleich. Maybe they would even have wanted full independence, but very aware that they needed to suppress all of these other groups. And that's going to lead to trouble and finally the dissolution of the whole edifice once we get very far into the 20th century, which contributes to the kind of situation we see today.
Okay. And that race through the past 800 years, I
Yeah,
think,
something like that.
brings us up to the recent geopolitical shifts in Hungary.
Yes, we're going to be back next in the next episode to look at how Greater Hungary came to a shuddering great stop after World War I, and how resentment about all those lost territories has set up a dynamic that's plagued things both inside the country and in its international relations ever since. So please join us for that, and don't forget in the meantime that like, subscribe, and share thing, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
I'm delighted to join you, and we'll see you next episode.
Bye now, everybody.